Next, to close out our little micro session related to fracking, is Brandon Nuttall, fracking in Kentucky.
First, I need to check. Nobody brought any crumbled donuts or bananas or fruit that they can throw, right? Okay. Okay. What is going on with fracking in Kentucky? Well, first of all, we need to understand exactly what it is. Fracking is where you inject high-pressure fluids underground to induce new fractures so that you can connect to an existing fracture system and create a large stimulated reservoir volume, a collection of permeable pathways for the oil and gas to flow into that well bore. There is an organization, Frack Focus. Frack Focus basically is sponsored by the Groundwater Protection Council and by the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. And they've been collecting data, self-reported data on fracking in the U.S. Well, the EPA harvested that data, and as part of a study, they have been looking at who was fracking, where it was, what chemicals were being used, what was the source of water, etc. And they have just recently released that study. It's the first part of a study on fracking that they're doing here in the U.S. Water typically is most of the material that's injected underground. It ranged from as small as about 30,000 gallons to more than 8 million gallons of water. Chemicals, in almost all cases, were 2% or less of the fluid, with the median amount of chemicals added being less than half of 1% of the volume of fluid injected. Those chemicals are used to control the fluid properties and to maintain well integrity. Sand is also used. It's typically up to about 24% of the material by weight, with a median of about 11%. So with that in mind of what they're doing with hydraulic fracking, what actually are they doing here in Kentucky? Well, it's actually been used in Kentucky for more than 200 years. Well, actually, the 1812 earthquake, that was natural fracturing. Anyway, there was a fella, if you get a chance to read, it's really interesting. He's got an account of his adventures in the Revolutionary War. He passed away here in Lexington. But he wrote about his profession. He was a water well driller. And he used explosives to improve those water wells as early as the late 1700s, early 1900s. The first well actually to be shot with explosives here in Kentucky was done in 1888. 1960, hydraulic fracturing itself was introduced here into the state. It had been invented in the 40s, was first used in Kansas, and I was recently involved in a conversation that some Kentucky wells may have been hydraulically fractured in the 1950s. I'm just trying to identify those wells. Hydraulic fracturing does not work very well in Kentucky's shale gas resources, specifically because of the hydrophilic clays in the shale. You inject the water, the shale absorbs the water and swells. You close the fractures almost as quickly as you can induce them. So it doesn't work very well. They experimented and found out that you could use nitrogen gas under pressure to fracture Kentucky's shale. And most of the vertical wells, especially those in the shale areas of Kentucky, are nitrogen fracture stimulated. When they started drilling horizontal wells in a big way, they wanted to use sand. They wanted to be able to place a proppant into the fractures that were induced. And in order to do that, they found that nitrogen gas is very inefficient. You can't blow enough sand in. So what they figured out how to do was they figured out how to make a foam, and so you have a nitrogen foam frac that has been used in Kentucky's horizontal wells. Hydraulic fracks are being used, as Marty and others have said, in the Berea in northeastern Kentucky, and some of the New Albany shale wells that are being completed in Breckenridge and surrounding counties are small hydraulic fracks. Typically, if we look at a section in eastern Kentucky, you've got the Pennsylvanian at the surface. Most of the fresh water is there, fairly near the surface. You've got coals in the Pennsylvanian. Natural gas occurs at various intervals throughout the section, as does oil and brine. And so when we look at the wells that are being drilled, typically you will, operators set the casing at the top of our thick carbonate sequence, Mississippian carbonate sequence known as the Big Line. The well is then built up and they drill into the Berea, and this is typically anywhere from about 1,200 to 1,800 or so feet deep. In the shale area of eastern Kentucky, they generally set the casing at the same depth in that Mississippian carbonate, but the wells themselves are anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 feet deep. So the big question is, of course, how much water is being used. You hear in many cases, for example, in the Marcellus and the Utica, they're using 5 million, 8 million gallons, even more than that on their fractures. In the Berea, they're using about the most amount of water in any of the frac jobs here in the state, but you can see that that's just barely over about 200,000 gallons. This is what's known as a slick water frac. They are using a chemical known as polyacrylamide, which is actually, it's a flocculant that's used in most municipal water treatment plants to help clarify the water. Nitrogen foam fracs are used in most of the Ohio Shale, the lower Huron. You can see that's even less. And in the New Albany Shale, it's hard to actually put that up there because that's a very small, they're just using just enough, barely enough water to be able to move sand into the fractures themselves. In Kentucky, in all, we have approximately 11,000 wells that have been fracked since 1980. And as I said, most of these are going to be nitrogen fracks in vertical wells. And this is a nitrogen frac. You'll see it going on. All of these tanks are liquid nitrogen delivered to the site. It goes into a heater where it's heated to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. All of these are, you can't see the piping, but they're all manifolded together. And back here you'll see there is a crane where they operate it on the wellhead. They are actually ventilating a bit of nitrogen so that the pumps and things do not cavitate as they're operating this. And you'll notice that there are a lot of operators on these trucks. They have to check each of these. Each of these in the individual pump truck, there's a big source of nitrogen. Horizontal wells are not that new here in Kentucky either. We've had a little over 1,600 permitted. Most of those, 98%, are related to the shale boom that started in 2006. And you can see Pike County has the most of them, where we're looking at shale gas wells, nitrogen foam completions. We've got the Berea slick water fracs going on in northeastern Kentucky. There is a small bit, like I say, of operations in the New Albany Shale in western Kentucky, but it really hasn't taken off yet. We look historically, between 1979 and 2005, only about 40 wells horizontal wells were permitted and drilled. In 2006, 43. That's more than all the state had up to that time. You see a big boom. These are shale gas wells that were nitrogen foam fracked in eastern Kentucky. And you can see that this had a great deal of influence on Kentucky's natural gas production. This year, we're producing a little over 256 billion cubic feet of gas. Turns out that Kentucky is now producing more natural gas than we're actually using. Now, the way it's being marketed, most of Kentucky's natural gas is marketed outside the state because that's the direction the pipelines flow. and we buy a lot of gas actually produced in the Gulf. Horizontal wells are also being used to target the oil in the Berea, and as I said, these are slick water fracks, and that too is having a great deal of effect on Kentucky's energy resources. As you can see, we've had a fairly steady decline for many years. Actually, this decline goes back to about 1960 when we started dropping off of our high of 27 million barrels produced that year. But in the last couple of years, activity in northeastern Kentucky has really taken off, and that's changed. For the first time since 1994, we're producing more than 4 million barrels of oil annually. As you can see, we've talked about most of this is in the Berea, in the Lawrence, and Greenup County areas. You can see that the magenta circles are the ones that are permitted as horizontal wells. And what's really interesting is that traditionally Union and Henderson County have been our #1 and #2 oil producing counties in the state. And this has been for many, many decades. Well, for the first time in decades, Lawrence County has taken over as #1 in the state, and you can see Greenup County is not far behind. We're regulated by the Kentucky Division of Oil and Gas. There is their website. They are working very diligently to improve our Kentucky Oil and Gas Well Operators Manual because this year we've had a huge update. Our current set of regulations were passed and adopted in 1960. And the Energy and Environment Cabinet Secretary Peters realized that we needed an update. We needed to get ahead of what's going on in hydraulic fracking, things like that. Need to catch our regulations up to the technology. And so they formed a work group with the Department of Natural Resources, Oil and Gas and Water, with the Economic Development folks, the Department of Agriculture, the Kentucky Oil and Gas Association, the Kentucky Resources Council, an Environmental Concerns Group, and the Kentucky Environmental Quality Commission. All of these worked together for about 8 months and came up with the Kentucky Oil and Gas Regulatory Modernization Act. This was introduced as both House Bill and Senate Bill 186. They went through the state legislature without a dissenting vote in committee or in either the houses. It was signed into law by the governor in March and will become law in June of this year. Specifically, what it does is it addresses hydraulic fracking by actually defining what high-volume hydraulic fracking means. When you do this, you pump more than 80,000 gallons of water in one stage or 320,000 gallons total. That's a high-volume frac, and it falls under these various rules. It requires baseline water quality testing before fracking and after fracking. You must notify surface owners within 1,000 feet of the wellhead before you do the fracking. It requires disclosure at a chemical registry, and it actually designates the registry as fracfocus.org. There are provisions that allow you to have trade secrets, but those trade secrets, the company must make an application to the cabinet that says we want trade secret status for this. And then if a health professional has a reason to get that information, then they can make application and get it. It also requires site reclamation and will set up some best management practices. Realizing that this is not the whole story on fracking, the whole story on the updates needed in the regulations, the cabinet has set up listening sessions. These will be for public comments, and they've got 3 of them scheduled: Hazard, Somerset, and Madisonville. But at this time, the dates and times have not actually been established. Public records are available at the Kentucky Geological Survey. We have scanned documents. Marty showed part of this document. I'm going to show 2 other parts where the casing and cement are located and where the completion and stimulation data are there. But again, all the chemicals will be available at the Frac Focus website. Kentucky joins a total of 27 states where the reporting is mandatory, and as I say, we have designated Frac Focus as our disclosure site. So in summary, fracking in Kentucky has been used for decades, and when combined with horizontal wells, it has really had a great deal of effect on Kentucky's oil and gas production. We now have a set of regulations in place that cover high volume hydraulic fracking in the state. Thank you.